Welcome back to Tell Your Story Alaska. Today we're covering the next two villages on our list. We are still in the A's, and today we will be doing Aniak and Anvik. If you listened to last week's episode, I just did one village called the Healing of Angoon, a really fascinating story that kind of came to a conclusion last month. Well, I guess it's December now, so end of October is when that happened. Anyway, today we're doing Aniak and Anvik. It so happens that these two villages are pretty close together. And so we'll just dive right in. Aniak is located in the Yukon Delta area in southwestern Alaska. It's about 92 miles northeast of Bethel. Now, Bethel's kind of a hub village. Its population several thousand. And you can fly an airline, Alaska Airlines, into Bethel. So I've been there many times. And it's about 92 miles north. It's a good measure of where things are in the Yukon Delta area. It sits on the south bank of the Kuskokwim River and at the head of the Aniak Slough. Now, I had to look up what a slough is because I didn't know. Again, my ignorance of geographical terms comes through when I look these up. So I looked this up. A slough is a wetland, which in this case is caused by a river changing its route, leaving stagnant water where the river once flowed. Now, these are very common in Alaska. And when I fly over Alaska, especially in this area, you can easily see where rivers once flowed. In fact, I remember flying with one of the other pilots, and I was just like, I wonder if we can date these rivers by, estimating how long it takes the rivers to change its course. And you can kind of see where courses were. And anyway, that's a bit out of my wheelhouse, but I kind of wondered about that. But you could see in these sloughs is where the river once flowed. And just because of the way rivers go, they change their routes every now and then. And they find new pathways of least resistance. And so Aniak sits on one of these sloughs, and these sloughs are very, very common. If you fly over the low tundra land, these rivers are always finding new routes. In fact, I know a lot of villages in Alaska have changed locations over the years because of the changes in the rivers. So I always thought that's pretty interesting. Aniak is a Yupik word meaning the place where it comes out. This refers to the mouth of the Aniak River, which flows into the much larger Kuskokwim at this spot. Interestingly, the Aniak River flows the north. Whenever I look at maps, when you look at rivers, like I grew up looking at maps of the United States, the Mississippi runs southward. I grew up near the Illinois River, and that always goes towards the south. It just seems like rivers are supposed to go south. But I know like the Nile River goes north, and it's kind of odd. But this is another one of those rivers that actually flows north, the Aniak River. So anyway, it's just kind of interesting. I wasn't able to find much on any pre-contact history. So before any Europeans or outsiders came over to Alaska, there's not much information. But it's said that the Yupik people that lived in this area deserted the original village before the first Russian explorers arrived. It is said that the lower end of the village used to be called Maruluk, or which means grandmother. Because there was some old woman that lived there a long time ago. The site was labeled Old Camp on the earlier maps, and this Old Camp location had nearly washed away. However, they said that artifacts were still emerging from the eroding riverbank up until the mid-1950s. It's hard to find specific data without going too deep into rabbit holes, which I did not do just for time's sake. But that's really interesting. I'd love to know what they found in these. I've been kind of obsessed with early Native American history for quite a long time. I'm reading a book right now about the first explorers in America. So Columbus came in 1492, and then the Pilgrims came in 1620, and we there's like this over 120, what's that, 128-year gap where we never learn about that history in school. So I've been finding a lot of content and books about that period because I'm very interested in what those early explorers uh, saw and what they record about the native people who are here. It's just so hard to find early Native American information. So I've been kind of obsessed with reading books on that lately. Anyway, it's frustrating that this is so hard to find information on this. It's just the data is so scant. At any rate, there were artifacts emerging from this location. Um, it says up until the mid 1950s. So I guess they stopped emerging after that. Based on early Russian explorer accounts, the population of the Kuskokwim River area, so all the villages along the river, in the early historic times was about 4,000. And I find that interesting because thinking about the population of native Alaska pre-contact is actually kind of an interesting study, just to get some perspective on what this land was like long ago. Now, according to the 1880 census of Alaska, which is the first one conducted, it's hard to tell how accurate it is, but it records that there were 31,240 Native Alaskans in the entire state. Now, today, that number is around 138,000. But really what this means is that Alaska has basically been a very scarcely populated place throughout its history. It's likely because of the harsh winters causing migrations to warmer climates. There's a lot of histories. Specifically, one of the most detailed ones is a book I have called The Red Record that records Native peoples traveling through Alaska down to the lower 48. It's a fascinating book if you ever get a chance. The Red Record. It's a Native American account of their own history. That one is just a great resource. Okay, in 1832, a Russian explorer named Seaman Lukin discovered gold in a river that he called Yellow River, referring to its yellowish color. Now, many people believe the Yellow River is referring to the Aniak River, but it's not totally certain. But it seems like the Russian history in this area is rather murky anyways. Other gold discoveries were made in the surrounding area by Russians, but they did not apparently engage in much mining. It wasn't until after the U.S. purchased Alaska in 1867 the first American prospectors trickle in to this area. Now, the story of Aniak as we know it today begins with the gold rush of 1900, where gold was discovered in Nome. It was actually discovered in like 1898 or something like that. But word got out, and in 1900, about 20,000 prospectors flooded into the Nome area. Now, initially, Nome was the place to go because that's where the gold was first found. But then old tales of gold being discovered by the Russian explorers in the quote-unquote Yellow River drew people into the Aniak area. By 1911, gold was definitely found in the Aniak area, and it is said that in 1912, there were 3 or 4 cabins there at Aniak. In 1914, a man named Tom L. Johnson first shows up because he filed a homestead there at Aniak. This is our first record of a permanent settlement at the location. The dates are interesting because these are the same years for the founding of Anchorage as well. And so all of it kind of happened around the discovery of gold. All right, so Tom L. Johnson, we know that he opened a store and a post office at the location. By 1930, Johnson's operation was described as, quote, a small-scale lone trader with a bunkhouse for guests. He sold his store in 1938 to the Northern Commercial Company, and that's the last we hear of Johnson. By 1936, 2 Eskimo families, Willie Pete and Sam Simeon, brought their families in from a place called Ohagamute. I got to pronounce that. I'm not sure about this pronunciation. Ohagamut? Something like that. I don't know. I need to work on that. Let's see. So they moved from Ohagamute. Yeah, we'll go with that one. They settled in Aniak, being the first Native Alaskans to live there. Of course, Native Alaskans lived there before, but this is kind of modern history. Now, I was curious about this village, Ohagamwit. I had trouble finding information about it. If you just Google it, not much comes up. But I did find an old map from a document. Ohagamwit. I'm never going to get that. Well, it was located just northeast of Kalskag, or 15 miles or so west of modern day Aniak. So apparently they made their way over from there. And as far as I can tell, I looked on Google Earth on this location. It looks like Ohagamwit no longer is a place anyone lives. Apparently, there were many small villages, according to these old maps I found, there along the Kuskokwim River. These quote-unquote villages probably made up just a couple of families each. And these later on congregated to places where post offices were established as the region became more populated and modernized. By 1936, there was enough residents to open a school in Aniak, and an airfield was made in 1939. By this time, the population was 122, according to the Census Bureau. As of 2020, Aniak is home to 507 people. 68% are Native and 25% are white, and there's a few other nationalities. So basically, today is still mostly a Native community. This means that Aniak basically became a village because traces amount of gold were found in the area. Like many other villages in Alaska, the dream of striking rich led to the establishment of many villages throughout Alaska, and Aniak is one of these. The promise of gold, fulfilling dreams of riches, and it draws people in. In 1956, something called a White Alice radar relay station was constructed. This created a population boom in Aniak, but the radar relay station shut down in 1978. And I know what you're thinking. What is a White Alice radar relay station? I asked the same thing. I had to look this up. I'm like, what is this thing they're talking about? Okay, the White Alice radar relay system was a network of 80 radio stations throughout Alaska. This is what I like about doing these village profiles. I'm kind of learning as I go, and it's just kind of fun. I had no idea that these relay stations existed. Okay, so I lost my spot on my notes. 80 relay stations throughout Alaska that took advantage of the troposphere, which bounces off certain radio signals for communications of the ballistic missile early warning system. In other words, it's a remnant of a time when ballistic missiles were brand new and they were scary because the thought of our enemies being able to launch a weapon at us from so far away. And so the U.S. military established these missile detection systems. And the White Alice radar relay station was a way to communicate any information between villages across the state of Alaska. This system was replaced in the 70s by modern satellites, but it is pretty cool because I found some photos of these huge kind of square dishes things that relayed these signals. You can find pictures online of them. The first church to emerge in Aniak was an Assemblies of God mission in 1945. In a small, they call it a satellite community. Nearby, a Russian Orthodox chapel was opened in 1953, which is really interesting because the Russian Orthodox Church was the first church in Alaska, but it was not the first in Aniak. It wasn't established until 1953. So it does go to show that the Russian Orthodox Church has been alive and well since the Russians were here early on. There's also an Orthodox church called Protection of the Theotokos Church, which opened in 1944. There's also a weekly Catholic Mass that is held, and that is called the Faith Community of St. Teresa. That's there in Aniak. The airport in Aniak is surprisingly large and well kept. And I have flown over Aniak a handful of times. As you're flying over just this vast empty tundra, suddenly there's this beautiful paved airstrip. So while most villages have just gravel runways, Aniak is paved and it's 6,200 feet long and 100 feet wide. So it's this beautiful runway in the middle of nowhere. The runway is 2911, and it even has an ILS approach on runway 11. And that means that for an ILS approach to be possible, you have to have some pretty fancy equipment on site. Now, most villages use RNAV approaches because it only requires a GPS signal and you don't have to install some fancy equipment on site. But for whatever reason, Aniak has an ILS approach, which requires equipment on site. So that's interesting. It makes Aniak a particularly nice place to land while flying across the vast tundra. Why Aniak is such a nice runway compared to most villages, I actually don't know. I looked into this a little bit, but my only guess is that it's because of the Wight Alice radar relay system, which was there until the late 70s, but I'm not really sure. But it's just kind of interesting. It is a very nice runway. And I've talked to some of the pilots coming out of there on the radio as I fly by, but I've never landed there. All right, so that is Aniak, Alaska. Let's talk about Anvik. Anvik, Alaska is located surprisingly close to Aniak. Remember, I'm doing these by alphabetical order, and these two villages happen to be quite close together. Anvik is located only 66 miles to the north of Anvik, and the name Anvik means exit, referring to the Anvik River, exiting into the Yukon at this location. It has historically been an Ingalik village and has been known by many names, such as American Station, Anvik, and Anwig. And I think somewhere else I saw it called Anvik Station. Today it's just called Anvik. The earliest report of people living there was by a Russian explorer named Andrei Glazunov. He reported seeing 100 people living there in 1834. So I looked into Glazunov because I'm a little bit obsessed with the early explorers, especially lately. Glazunov was a mixed race man, so he was Russian and natives, half Russian, half native. This was common at the time because there were so few Russians. I read somewhere that there were never more than 1,000 Russians in Alaska when this fur trade was going on. I'm always surprised at how few that is, but that's how many there were. So it was common because there were so few Russians in Alaska, not a lot of Russian ladies around. And so unions between Russians and natives created a generation of mixed race children that they called Creoles. Creoles were relied upon for their cross-cultural capabilities to help the Russian Fur Company expand its operation. In January of 1834, Glazunov left St. Michael's, and I've been to St. Michael's. It's on the northern side of the Yukon Delta, and it's on the coast. He left St. Michael's to explore western Alaska to establish trade with natives along the Yukon River. Glazunov made his observation of Anvik on this expedition, which ultimately ended because he ran out of food and he had to turn back to St. Michael's. However, in 1836, Glazunov returned to the area and established a village called Ikagmuit. And that is what that village today is Russian Mission, which I have been to many, many times. I thought that was really interesting. Okay, a notable missionary in Anvik was a man named John Wight Chapman. Chapman wrote a paper on his 40 years in Anvik. He called it 40 years in Anvik. I think ultimately he ended up spending 44 years in Anvik, serving in that one place the whole time. And Chapman originally thought his time there was going to be temporary, but he ended up staying for most of his life. He started there in 1888 is when he first got there and started building. He came on the coattails of another Jesuit priest named Parker, but Parker soon left after Chapman's arrival. Chapman described getting his supplies from St. Michael's, which is As I said, it's a coastal town where ships could drop off supplies. St. Michael's 120 miles away over the frozen tundra in the wintertime. But in the summertime, because everything got wet and soft, you had to take everything by boat, which was a 450-mile journey. And you had to weave through all the rivers and make your way over to Anvik. However, when a railroad was completed to Nenana, Alaska, which is hundreds of miles away, he was able to receive supplies by barge from Nenana, which made things a little bit easier for him. Chapman immediately opened a school upon his arrival, and he made an effort to learn to speak the Athabascan language of Anvik from the children. And meanwhile, he taught them to speak English, and he taught them how to read and write. And in this article about his own experience there, he goes into some detail of this work that he did. Chapman did the laborious task of translating the scriptures and some prayer books into the Athabascan language. He also recorded their oral stories in an effort to preserve their vanishing culture. And he actually used that word. He wanted to preserve their vanishing culture. Now, I used to live in Mexico. I learned to speak Spanish, and then I learned to speak an indigenous language. And I can tell you this is an unbelievably difficult task. And I did this with a lot of help. There were missionaries that were there before me. They had done most of the headwork on the language, and I was able to pick that up and improve upon the material and use it to learn it myself. And I did translation work and stuff. But for someone like Chapman to do this by himself in a remote village with children, this is an unbelievably difficult task. You have to pick up all the little sounds and nuances of language, and you have to start pulling meaning out of them. And different languages have different nuances. It's very, very challenging. We have nuances. When we speak English, we have innuendos and we have slang, and we slur our words in English. And there's different dialects, and all of that must be considered when you're making translations or learning a language. But Chapman, even though it was a very difficult and very monotonous and very frustrating task, Chapman was determined to both communicate the gospel in their own language and to preserve their own oral histories. So he recorded these. Eventually, Chapman talked about getting a microphone, and he began recording them. I did not look to see if these recordings are available, but they might be. That would be fascinating. So these records might be out there. I haven't taken the time to look yet. But yeah, that would be awesome to get some of these oral histories that he recorded in Anvik. Okay, so Chapman goes on to describe his time in Anvik in quite a bit of detail. It's a really fascinating read. He makes interesting observations about the lives of the native people. And he talked about them making basically saunas and some of the other things they did. Very fascinating. His affections for the people in Anvik were very obvious. He labored to save as many lives as he could during the flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919. This epidemic decimated native populations throughout Alaska, and this decimation left many orphans behind, many of which ended up becoming wards of the Jesuit mission there in Anvik when they became adults. So I thought that was pretty cool. At the end of Chapman's personal record of his time, I think he wrote it in 1931 about his time in Anvik. This is how he ended his record of that time. He said, quote, "As I leave the country to which I owe some of the greatest satisfactions which I feel that life can afford, I cannot help believing that there is good reason for the hope that what has already been attained is but a promise of what is yet to come. Of late years, especially my associations with those who have been sent out by the church to work with us at Anvik have been such as to give me great confidence that the spirit of adventure for Christ is a living force among us, disposing us to accommodate ourselves to one another and to go forward together to make it possible for others to share in the blessings with which he has sustained us." I really liked how he ended his record there. All right, another notable person was a priest named, I wrote Jesuit, but I'm pretty sure it was Catholic priest, named Aloysius Robaut. Robaut? Robaut. Aloysius Robaut. After his traveling companion, who was another Catholic priest, was murdered near Nulato, Robaut made his way downriver to Anvik. And there he met Chapman, who was already there. And soon upon arrival, Robaut became very sick, and Chapman helped nurse him back to health. And he stayed there in Anvik for a short time. But upon receiving an invitation to another village further downriver and seeing that Chapman was well rooted there, Robaut left and he started a Catholic mission at a village that is now called Holy Cross. Of his time in Alaska, Robaut said, quote, "Those winters of 7 months with interminable nights in houses poorly lit and poorly heated were too much for those men then psychologically were not equal to it. It took a strong physical constitution, a nervous system firmly set on an even keel, a healthy sense of humor," I like that part, "a character impervious to moodiness, and a zeal for the glory of God. To survive, one had to possess them all, and in a heroic degree." And it's so true. These early missionaries, they were not as adapted as the local native people were. They didn't have knowledge of keeping warm probably as well as the native people. They really had to be pretty tough people to get through it. All right. Today, Anvik has a population of 70 people, which is down quite a bit from its peak number of 191, which was in 1890 at its peak population. So Anvik has shrunk quite a bit. So while lacking specific percentages, Anvik is overwhelmingly populated by native people. So most of the 70 people there are native. Now, I don't believe I've ever landed at Anvik, but I have flown near it. The airstrip is on an elevated piece of land, rising above the Yukon at 297 feet. It's a gravel runway like most native village airstrips, and it's 4,000 feet long, and it has an RNAV approaches on both directions of runway 1735, which is pretty standard for Alaska's runways. They like to use RNAV because it doesn't require any on-site equipment. But with RNAVs, you usually can't get as low as like an ILS, but still, I like RNAVs. They're really easy to fly. All right. Well, that is all I have for today with Aniak and Anvik, the two A villages on our list today, which happen to be pretty close together. But next week, our two villages are very, very far apart. So it's kind of opposite. Arctic Village is in northeastern Alaska. It's way, way up there. It's pretty far north. And then Atka is one of the westernmost villages near the tip of the Aleutian Island chain. It's way, way out there. So kind of opposite sides of the state that we will cover next week. Arctic Village and Atka. So that's all for today. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to Tell Your Story, Alaska.